Well, good afternoon, and thank you for coming back from lunch. Please find your way to your seats, and we will begin our plenary session on cyber learning infrastructures. So you may remember this morning that I talked about one of the big challenges that we're facing as integration, that we have many pieces of the train that we're trying to build to replace the stagecoach of the industrial era school. But those pieces have to be put together in an organized way in order to make that effective. And I'm just delighted that I was able to persuade John Seeley Brown, known as JSB, and Janet Kolodner, and I'll say a bit about both, and then when they talk, they will provide more detailed introductions. But these are two people that, for me, have been seminal in my thinking about cyber learning infrastructures. So JSB, with me, was one of the 15 people on the technical working group for the National EdTech Plan. He and Dan Atkins at the University of Michigan pretty much wrote the infrastructure section of the plan. But I first became aware of JSB in the mid-'70s when I was really just starting my career. And he doesn't know this, but I went through a very discouraging phase in which every time I had an idea and I started to look around for who'd been thinking about it, I found that JSB had already been thinking about it for 3 years, and he'd abandoned it as unfruitful 1 year ago. So I was personally delighted when he moved into the corporate structure at Xerox because it distracted him enough that I didn't have that problem in the future, which was terrific. So I'm really happy that he's here to share ideas with us. And then I asked Janet to come not only because as a program officer at NSF, she's been central in the cyber infrastructure and the cyber learning work, but because she also has been really crucial to the learning sciences community and to the evolution of the whole field of learning sciences. So she not only has the background in computer science, but she is very deep thinking. And in fact, both of them have done very deep thinking about how people relate to the technical side of cyber infrastructure. So our game plan is this. I'm going to just frame a question. JSB will talk for about 10 minutes. Janet will talk for about 10 minutes. I'll throw out a couple other things the three of us can dialogue about, and then we'll throw it open to you to raise questions or issues for us. So what is cyber learning infrastructure exactly, other than a big collection of syllables? Well, in the 2010 National EdTech Plan, there was a learning section, there's an assessment section, there's a teaching section. And then we said, if this is what learning, assessment, and teaching are, what do we need to make these happen? That's infrastructure. And mobile devices and wireless broadband, of course, fit into a larger context of infrastructure of all types and complement rather than replace many parts of that infrastructure. So how broad is this concept really? Well, the plan talks about the fact that, yes, there's hardware, there's some kind of a back end, and that has really emerged as the cloud, and different people here and different people at prior wireless EdTech conferences have talked about the cloud and how important the cloud can be as a resource that lets individual schools in particular get out of the networking business or the device business, outsource some of that, and be able to focus on teaching and learning. But it's also the learning resources that live on those devices, both open and proprietary. And other people here, of course, have described some very interesting initiatives to build those types of learning resources. Some of them are quite sweeping, as we heard from Amplify this morning. Others are as simple as a single app. And we're all trying to understand the ecology of those learning resources. But then it's assessments as well. And one of the breakout sessions coming up next is about assessments in mobile learning. And in particular, it's not simply digitizing multiple choice tests and classic tests of different kinds as assessments, but it's looking at new forms of assessments that can really measure 21st century skills and competencies. And it's analytics. And we've heard about that as well at the conference over the years, that the mobile infrastructure and all parts of cyber infrastructure can capture enormous amounts of data, which is not easy to understand, but which is potentially quite valuable in helping us evaluate, in helping us assess, in helping us get customized feedback to improve. It's policies. So there isn't a stakeholder in the room that doesn't have a piece of cyber infrastructure, because it's policies for making the infrastructure work and also for making it sustainable and capable of continuous improvement. But I think the most crucial part of cyber infrastructure last. It's really skilled people. So when we think about infrastructure, often we think just about the hardware side of infrastructure. But any infrastructure is a doorstop unless skilled people are really a part of it. So I think we can be quite wide-ranging as we talk about these different dimensions of infrastructure. So with that, JSB, I'm going to hand you the clicker, and please tell us more about yourself if you want to, and then how you think about these issues.
So let's see. Let me.
It should.
Got it.
Yep. There you go.
Okay. So I like to think about what is the challenge we really have, and from my point of view, we now have an opportunity with the cyber infrastructure and many of the ideas being talked about here to step back and ask, how can we actually create the resilient, resourceful, might call it almost entrepreneurial learner. By entrepreneurial, I do not mean being an entrepreneur, but one who can, a kid who can basically find resources wherever he or she looks, to be able to find those resources, do something with that. In terms of how do we look at the big job of cultivating, you might call it the inquisitive mind. And I think the world we're coming from, and the reason why the cyber infrastructure is so important, is we now are moving into a world in which the half-life of virtually any particular skill is about 5 years. So it used to be that we could be trained and learn something for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. Now it's reduced to about 5 years. This means we have to figure out kind of more of an arc of life learning. And how does the infrastructure we're talking about permeate everything we do in that arc of life type learning? But it's more than that, because we really have is a fundamental shift, if you wish, from how do you move from a world in which everything was very predictable, where everything was done under the guise of scalable efficiency. This is how we taught 100 people to a class, et cetera, to looking at how do we shift this game to thinking about not shifts of stocks, but to a world of flows. And where the game now is knowledge and activities are flowing by us all the time. They even made us turn off our cell phones to get here, if you notice. How do we participate in these knowledge flows? And these two images here is a massive classroom on the one hand and a maker space. Actually, a shot in San Francisco a few months ago, in terms of these kids actually getting engaged in community activities, creating their own communities, constantly building things, learning from each other, and other masters in the area, so on and so forth. So think about this kind of shift from stocks to flows in terms of the challenges we want our new infrastructures to be able to handle. But you started out talking about ecologies. I think we have to take ecologies much more broadly, and to recognize that kids today have discovered much broader ecologies than we in the professional education world necessarily think about. And here's just a trajectory of a kind of youth in terms of how do they spend most of their time. Actually, they don't spend it in school, they spend it outside of school. And if you look at the trajectories of these kids, especially in urban settings, you can start to map out how they have after-school programs, how they use museums, libraries, community centers, so on and so forth. And we have to kind of start thinking about an infrastructure that doesn't separate the school from everything else, but does it in a truly integrative way, and kind of honors the sense that we have a trajectory through a knowledge ecology, hopefully producing and cultivating the inquisitive student, if you wish. And the beauty of this previous one is, how do you brought up assessment. Well, one of the catches is, how do you actually show what I'm learning? And of course, I could have portfolios that I show, but an interesting issue being explored now, coupled to social networks and other tools like Mosaic, how do you start taking kind of the badges more seriously as a way for students to be able to get some credit for what they're doing as they traject through this very rich knowledge ecology. And I think it causes you to step back and realize, in terms of the theory of connected learning, about how kids really learn, we've been focusing, if you wish, on the academic formal schooling part. But in fact, most of these kids develop interest one way or another. And once they develop an interest, you can barely keep knowledge away from them given the right types of infrastructure. So they're pulling all kinds of resources to them. But there's another thing besides kind of passion-based, interest-driven learning that can complement the formal learning. There's also the notion of peer culture. And how does peer culture interact with interest-driven culture, interest-driven communities of interest and practice, to also the academic? And how do we now think about this as a different type of an ecology as kids kind of traject through this whole type of space? And if done right, basically you've really shifted from thinking of education as a push model to education as a pull model. So as soon as you start thinking about pull, with Elliot in the room here someplace, let's kind of recognize what is the real essence of these mobile devices. Said simply, I think the mobile device is basically a curiosity amplifier. It's interest-driven learning, learning on demand. And here, honestly, is a 2-year-old totally entranced by watching his 5-year-old sister actually look something up. And all of a sudden you begin to realize this isn't just a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, but in fact, I imagine tonight, when we go out for dinner together, you're going to be sitting around the table, somebody's going to bring up a topic, use a word, use a phrase, raise a question, and you're going to say, well, I'm not sure I agree, or I'm not sure quite what that means. And almost without noticing, you pull out your cell phone or your iPad or whatever, and you will Google it and pull it in, and basically a conversation starts to develop. And it's amazing how much of this kind of arc of life learning, rich conversations become key, and rich conversations are fueled by being able to pull on demand new information in to kind of enrich the conversation. So this is kind of a very informal kind of learning, but very, very powerful type of learning that our infrastructures have to really be able to support. I just want to look at a couple of these examples. I feel bad using this example with Elliot here, but think about these things as kind of alternative reality games for mobile learning. And I want to talk just about one example. I was going to talk about the world without oil, but didn't have time. I'm going to talk about NOAA, and one other example of NOAA, having to do with getting kids in terms of STEM education engaged in the broader ecosystem of plant life, animal life, and how in fact plants and animals have trajectories through their own ecosystems that actually can be mapped out and actually lead to the doing of real science, citizen science, at the same time of very interesting formal learning. And here is a beautiful little app on a phone called NOAA, done by a very, very tiny startup that actually is a way for kids to go on missions, looking out for particular forms of species, animal or plants. I've been engaged more with the plant game. We're trying to actually map how invasive plants move through Maine. And this becomes kind of a scientific notebook, and also letting kids pull information in because they don't quite know all this stuff. And you can start to actually build mappings of where things are happening, actually through the infrastructure, put this on, because now this is being used worldwide, to be able to kind of talk about recordings of unusual species that have been spotted, and so on and so forth. So it brings kind of a form of inquisitiveness to play in a very kind of situated way where you actually have experts communicating with the students when they actually try to say, well, here is a photograph of something I think is X, then you can have a dialogue about this and so on and so forth. It's obvious all the things you could actually start to do with this. The last example, very briefly, is in the same spirit, because all these devices now can be done even without major corporate sponsorship if you have the infrastructure right. This is the MIT App Inventor Kit that goes on Android phones, coming originally from Google, of course. And it sets up a tool case for kids to be able to build their own apps for themselves and other students, or teachers building their own apps. And this has become quite interesting, again, used in terms of, again, the STEM education, out there looking at parts of the ecosystem. By the way, this was not in Georgia, but close by. In terms of here, these kids finding unusual sightings, use his app to kind of plot that. And you can see they're building their own community of interest, cross-cutting formal school to informal school and so on and so forth. This didn't require a major corporation to build. I think it required basically a week to build with the right type of toolkit, with the right kind of backup work on that.
And it's place-based. It goes with where they live.
Yes. Yeah, in fact, precisely as my last slide.
Okay.
No, you'll see in a second. That's the whole point. We really want to integrate play, making, and knowing all together. This is a thing that's brand new. This only went live like last week before last. It's very surprising. This is actually Michael Sandel's course at Harvard, probably the most popular course, I think, at Harvard on ethics and justice. Here he has a small class of 450 students that he has developed an amazing Socratic method with. What you may not realize is he has perfected his methodological stance to now, I have seen him do this in a classroom of 12,000 students, not in this country, but in Seoul, Korea. So we're starting to work with him and saying, could we build a global classroom that kind of honors his Socratic method, where basically, if you're not in the immediate classrooms, you can be participating as a legitimate peripheral participant, going back to our old stuff, as part of this. And this is just, this class went live, I think, 2 weeks ago at Harvard. And it's a very interesting new technology called Together Justice. They also have an app called Together Learn and Together Talk that is built around the TED Talks and so on. But it's a whole sense of, can we bring people in as kind of an emotional connection as well as a social connection? It's trying to move up the hierarchy to an experience architecture. And I won't bore you with the details, but this turns critically on some very nice cloud structures that sit behind the app structures to make this all possible. This, kids don't do by themselves. I mean, this requires some very complicated stuff. This is working on almost zero latency, things that fly below TCP/IP, et cetera. That's surprising how well this works. But what we're all after, I think, is kind of understanding that we're moving into a world we want to think about a kind of an architecture of participation. We might call this in this room Learning 2.0, having to do with this shift from push to pull. And the beauty of pull-based learning is it honors inherently kind of situated learning. And I think we know that situated learning is probably where reigns supreme, and it really does combine the art of play, the art of making, the art of creating hypotheses, the art of being able to have experts and you interact, often from a distance through this technology. And in that sense, getting out there and doing, not just receiving. And I think with that, thank you.
John, thank you. So Janet, that was one slice through this very complex construct of infrastructure. How do you think about it?
So my slice through it actually is very complementary to yours. This is very nice. So JSB, you gave me a very good introduction. What I want you to notice about what JSB was talking about is that he wasn't talking simply about kids knowing things. He was talking about them being able to do things. He was talking about them being able to interact with each other in ways that lead to some very deep learning, okay, that lead to some very sophisticated kinds of capabilities. And what I want to claim is that there are 4 really important parts of that infrastructure that Chris was talking about before that are going to be needed to achieve those goals. Okay, so actually, they're not exactly the pieces of the infrastructure Chris talked about, but they're related enough. So one of the things Chris talked about was skilled people, okay, to make it happen. And out of my 4 items, 3 of them are about skilled people. Okay, first of all, imagination about possibilities. What is it possible to do with the technology that, you know, we don't think about happening in schools now? Okay, so you saw some examples of that. Laura this morning talked about capturing experiences along the way, about augmenting reality to experience history in London. Okay, JSB and Laura both talked about NOAA, okay, about doing something in your own backyard, right, that contributes to big scale to knowledge around the world. And what's really neat about that, and what JSB just showed us, is that the software is built in such a way, okay, that it invites curiosity, right? You look at displays, okay, and the displays are inviting you to say, now, why are there more of them in that part of the world than the other part of the world? Okay, it's inviting at least some of us, right, to ask questions. So imagination about possibilities is, I think, really essential, okay, to being able to make this kind of vision happen. Beyond accessing, using wireless, beyond accessing information, beyond supporting communication, beyond capturing snapshots of a class's understanding, you know, beyond capturing what people are capable of and interested in. I mean, it's so much more. So that's one kind of skill that we need more of. Another skill I think we need more of is humility about the challenges in making all of it work. I mean, just because those applications are there, okay, just because people are going to makerspaces, you know, it doesn't mean they're learning. Just because they're getting excited about something, it doesn't mean that they're learning. Okay, there's all kinds of complicated things that have to happen, okay, in order for people to move forward with their capabilities, to move forward with their understanding, to go beyond just knowing facts, okay? And so we've got to get people, more people who are working on technology, or we've got to get more integrated teams of people, people with imagination and people who understand how learning works, to figure out how you can use the technology in the context of these playful kinds of situations that can draw people in, get them excited, keep them excited over time, and what are the roles that people need to play? What are the roles technology needs to play? What are the roles different kinds of people need to play? Peers, mentors, parents, okay, in order for the learning to actually happen systematically. Okay, and I don't mean systematically as in everybody learning the same thing, and I don't mean systematically in terms of everybody on the same pace, but I mean getting a lot out of situations, getting what can be gotten, a lot of what can be gotten out of them. That's all going to take a third thing, okay? I think some really intensive professional development. Professional development for teachers, professional development for administrators, professional development for policymakers, maybe for parents, you know, maybe for pastors and rabbis and whatever. You know, I mean, all the different people who are helping people learn or who are interested in creating environments for helping people learn. And I think the professional development may not need to be so much about technology, but may need to be way more about how do people learn, what's it take to be able to really understand something, What's it take to be able to really gain expertise? Okay? Because we want the solutions to be such that we've got people, okay, who can think things through deeply. Okay? Not just people who are going to follow recipes and have one job for the rest of their lives. Okay? So I think that that's a really essential part of the infrastructure. And my other part of the infrastructure that I think we need is materials. And that was one of them that was in Chris's. And the particular kinds of materials we need, I think we need to start with model materials of lots of different grain sizes. Okay? What are the kinds of technologies and how can you use them that could be pervasive? Okay? So how could these things, right, be used in, this is a iPad. How can these things be used in really effective, interesting ways in school, outside of school, through life, okay, across classes, across venues, okay? Not simply to take notes, not simply to look things up, not simply having the book online, not simply even having that fancy thing that Laura showed us this morning, okay? Beyond that, okay? And maybe simpler than that. What are the ways that some devices can be used? So that's one kind of materials. And having model technologies, model ways of using them that enough people put into place and, you know, they get good enough, they turn viral. That's fine. Okay? Another thing that we need is curriculum units that use technology in ways that make sense, okay, and that have people learn, come to deeply understand things, come to be able to do things, project-based, problem-based kinds of curriculum units, okay, that have people learning skills. I don't know, I hesitate to say 21st century skills, but I'll say it anyway. That have people learning those skills that people talk about as 21st century skills, including reading. Somebody mentioned that earlier this morning. Okay? Learn those things and deeply learn some content, okay, and gain some real expert capabilities at the same time. And with technology integrated in ways that really make sense. But that's not enough. Okay, because we want coherent people coming. That's not exactly the way I want to say it, but I don't know how to say it otherwise. We want people coming out of our education system who there's some coherency, okay, to the set of things they know and are able to do. It's not just, I know a little bit of history, and I know a little bit of chemistry, and I know a little bit of physics, and I know a little bit of I don't know what else, geology, okay? There's certain skills in terms of inquiry that everybody has, and certain skills in terms of explanation, and certain skills in terms of investigation, and the ability to pull together things that they've learned and connect things, have really highly connected models of things. And so we need more than curriculum units. We need ways of going through a curriculum, okay, that give some of that result in some of that coherency, okay? And we need to remember, okay, as people have been saying all morning, that learning doesn't all happen in school, okay? And JSB had a picture there that he showed you. It doesn't all happen in school. So models that show ways of helping people make connections between the things they're doing in school and the things they're doing at the museum and the things they're doing after school and the things that they're tinkering with in the garage and what they're doing in hackerspace and everything else.
So as I listen to the two of you talk about this, there's a couple thoughts that come to my mind. One of them is that tools are not neutral. Infrastructures are not neutral. Somebody came up with the idea of the screw and then designed the screwdriver as the perfect tool for being able to use screws to hold things together. A device that is designed to apply torque. And somebody else came up with the nail and the hammer. You can't use a hammer easily to put screws into something, and you can't use a screwdriver easily to put nails into something. They're not interchangeable. Now, we know that our digital infrastructures ultimately are very complex artifacts that have many different tool functions built inside of them, but they're also built with a purpose. It's going to be easier to do certain things with them than other things, depending on how they're built. And so this whole issue of what is the learning that we're building the infrastructure for, which both of you have centered on, I think is at the heart of the matter. Because if we build a push infrastructure that's about classrooms and place-based and time-based learning, that's different than if we build a pull-based infrastructure that's centered on situated learning and then draws on things like classroom learning to accomplish some of what Janet was talking about in terms of coherency and getting beneath interest into deep learning. So that's one thing that it seems to me often is lacking in these infrastructure plans, is this underlying issue of, well, what's the goal, and therefore how do you skew the tools so that it makes it easier to get to one goal than to another goal. But the other thing that I was thinking about is this situated learning concept. And some of you may be familiar with a book called How People Learn that was published by the National Research Council in 1999. John Bransford was one of the key figures in developing that. It, I think, is the second best-selling report that the NRC ever released, and just really served as a foundation to elevate the discussion of learning within the field. But in that, it talked about, among the different kinds of learning, situated learning as potentially one of the most powerful, but one of the least understood and one of the least used. And I remember when JSB and some colleagues in 1989 published a very influential piece in Education Researcher that made the case for situated learning. And a lot of Janet's early work was around case-based learning, right, which is in fact situated learning. So I know that in our work with augmented reality, we think a lot about situated learning, and it's hard. And I think as a professor about my own different kinds of learning that I use in different contexts. I have students who take courses from me. And the courses are often project-based, and they often involve going out into the real world and doing things in the real world. But ultimately, it's a course, and it has a curriculum, it has assignments, it has a regular meeting time, it has a beginning and an end. It's still, I use pull, but it's still fundamentally a push model. But then I think about other kinds of students that I have that are postdocs or that are graduate research assistants, and they're not taking courses from me. They're involved in research projects of different kinds. And it's a mixture of push and pull because the research project has objectives. But there, I'm serving as a mentor. I'm trying to structure the project in such a way that they can build on their interests and learn from it. It's fundamentally a situated learning model rather than a kind of a classic instructionist learning model. And I find that harder. Now, maybe that's just me, but I find it harder to design those really good situated learning experiences where, in a sense, I have less control as the instructor than so. Granted that it's so, okay, so now I've run around the barn and I'm ready to ask the two of you something about situated learning and about tools. So
we're going to have to define situated learning.
You're going to have to define situated learning, by the way, but that's fun too. So as we think about situated learning and an infrastructure that would actually support situated learning, isn't there a lot of devil in the details here? Don't we know better, and at least I'll say this about me, I know better how to do the less powerful form of learning than the more powerful form of learning. And what do we need to do to get smarter about situated learning?
Can I start by trying to define situated
Sure.
learning in a way that we won't argue about?
Sure.
We don't want to argue about it, right?
No.
So situated learning, I think we don't want to think about it as a type of learning. we want to think about it as a theory about learning that says that what we learn and the way we learn is very dependent on the situation we're in. Every situation we're in is a situation, is situated. When you're in the classroom, that's a situation too, okay? And the idea in situated learning, that as if you're designing, taking that into account, okay, if you're designing learning experiences, then you're taking into account and you're thinking about what are all the different kinds of things that you might want to design into the environment, including the kinds of interactions you might want people to have with each other, including the kinds of physical materials you might have, the kinds of technological tools that you might have in the environment, the kinds of availability of people in other places, okay, that you might want, the kinds of activities they might do, okay, that are going to together, and yes, the devil's in the details, lead to whatever are the targeted outcomes. Now, you can also, that's an educational approach to situated learning, okay? Situated learning itself is a theory of learning, and then when we talk about taking it into account in the world and designing, taking that theory into account, taking that as our basis, okay, then we're talking about designing in such a way that we have a little bit of control or a lot of control, okay, over the kinds of situations people are in, okay, so that there's a good likelihood that they're going to reach whatever are, if we're in a formal context, whatever are the goals that that formal context has. In an informal context, the goals can be much more diverse. Can we mostly agree to that?
Absolutely, and let me just summarize it with maybe one key phrase. We're moving from just content to context and content.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
And what's so nice, if you look at it this way, and let me respond to two ways to your comment. What it forces us to do is think about how do we structure context as much as the content.
That's right.
Okay? And this shift from content to context provides kind of a dimension of subtlety and nuance. And we now have, I mean, you might think part of the purpose of the infrastructure is new ways to shape context. And if many of you are hardcore gamers, as a couple of us are, in terms of massive multiplayer games, that whole game is about shaping context. And you know, so think about that. Okay. But I want to come back to your comment too, because I think that the devil is in the details, maybe, maybe not. Maybe what really matters, if I dare use the word, is to go meta slightly and say the real reason why most of us, yours and my age, not yours, Janet, but, you know, have trouble in some of the shifts you're talking about, is the kind of learning we're talking about in these situated context. You have to give up control, number one. And two, you got to be completely comfortable with your kids asking you questions that you are clueless at how to be able to do. And I suggest that there's one simple inversion. If you have this inversion, this stuff starts to work out without much trouble. Think about the notion of reverse mentorship. Okay, in situated learning, you become a mentor. But if basically when you get stumped, you know, how do you and the kid work together? Or how do the kids actually educate you? And if you're in the gaming world, it's not too hard to learn a hell of a lot from these kids. You know, and so there's a whole sense of...
And how do they learn from how can you make it so they'll learn from each other, or with each other?
With each other. And that's why the third circle in that connected learning called peer culture is something not talked about. And so, you know, one of the major efforts in that realm is how do you shape peer culture? And if you can actually get in there and start shaping the context in the peer culture, you've basically won the game. Because the rest of the stuff is there to be pulled. But if the peer culture isn't supporting it, it won't happen. And so there's a lot of interest in the connected learning. And if some of you who follow this now know that this group has now signed on Lady Gaga, who is going to become the spokesperson for this peer-based learning. to try to, again, look at powerful forces. I'll call that a powerful force. Not a hammer quite, but
Right.
to shape that a little bit and to see how we now look at shaping all three of those spheres.
So I want to respond. I basically agree with all of that, okay? And I want to make it a little easier for you guys to think about it. You don't have to think about it as crowdsourcing, okay?
Right.
I mean, it starts feeling to me really impossible when you start thinking about it as crowdsourcing and Lady Gaga. And I don't know how you get from interest to real learning when you start doing it that way. Maybe my imagination's not good enough, but I know how to shape classrooms, okay? I know how to shape classrooms, okay? And I think that there's a lot you can do in shaping classrooms. So let me just tell you a little bit about that. I started out, as Chris said, in artificial intelligence, and I was creating a way of having the computer be able to learn from its experiences. It was called case-based reasoning. It was influenced by people, but there was no literature on this stuff. There was no research on this stuff. So we were making it up as we went along. Okay? And we created algorithms, we created heuristics, we created ways of the computer being able to learn from its experiences. It could do things like plan meals, could do things like at Lockheed, they had a case-based program, piece of software that was figuring out how to place things in the autoclave, place composite parts in the autoclave so that they baked at the same rate. Mediation, doing it in a case-based way, remembering back to an old situation, and that old situation providing pointers about how to manage things in the new situation. Okay, and we got the computer to be pretty good at solving new problems based on its old experiences and learning. Okay, it solved problems, it made mistakes, it got feedback from us. Sometimes it got feedback from the world it lived in, but it got feedback from us about what happened as a result of things it did. It interpreted some of that. Sometimes we helped it interpret. But it got better at solving problems over time. It derived lessons from its experiences. With help from people, the computer was learning from its experiences. And what the computer did to be successful seemed to maybe be something we could help people do better. It was learning from its experiences like people do, and I was learning as a researcher, what are the ins and outs of being able to do that learning systematically? What are the trade-offs in doing some difficult reasoning at the time you have an experience and doing some other reasoning at the time you have the next experience, to be able to use those old experiences? So I thought maybe we could help people learn science better, okay, by having them reflect on their experiences in ways that would help them remember their experiences and reuse them. Now, the problem was I was going to build software that would help people reflect, and there was no curriculum around to attach that software to. Okay, so what happened was I went into the business of writing curriculum units. Okay, and I knew all this stuff about how to help people build mental models well. Okay, and I needed to take it into classrooms and have kids be able to learn. And I have to tell you that I did a good job of it, okay? I'll just tell you that. The approach is called learning by design, okay? The kids addressed design challenges as a class, and in the process, they shared responsibility for planning, design, investigation, question, asking, answering, explanation. They learned tremendous amount of science. They learned to think like scientists, okay? And I'm not going to tell you the whole story of this. I want to tell you it took 15 years to put together a 3-year curriculum, okay? It's called Project-Based Inquiry Science, if any of you want to look it up, okay? It took 15 years to put together a full 3 years of middle school science curriculum, okay? And the kids learn a lot, okay? But it's not simply because they're doing all of this reasoning. They are doing all of this reasoning. It's not simply because of that. We had to figure out how to get them to want to do it. Okay, the first thing we figured out in getting them to want to do it was that if they shared responsibility for investigations with their peers and then had to report to each other and they all needed each other's stuff, you know, what each other had learned, then they'd act like middle schoolers. They'd perform for each other. They'd get very excited about it. They'd be really excited about reusing each other's ideas. And they'd listen to each other and they'd help each other learn. And that works. Except it doesn't work when the kids don't feel that that's expected of them. Okay? So we also needed to figure out how do you make the culture such, in the classroom such, that the kids have a want to do these things, that the kids are expecting, that kids feel like they're expected to do it at a certain level and to participate at a certain level, that they're expected to help each other out, that they're expected to find flaws in their friends' reasoning. Okay? We invented something called launcher units to help people do that, where they're getting into all these practices early in the year and it really shapes the classroom culture. Okay? I'm not going to tell you a lot more than the challenges the kids are working on. They have to be interest-driven. But it doesn't mean all the kids come in already interested in making toy cars go way far. It doesn't mean kids all come in interested in how do we design a breed of rice that will feed people in the Philippines when there isn't enough rain like there used to be for the rice that they have now. But we figured out that we could get kids interested in those things and really engaged and enjoying it. Okay?
So
those are the challenges.
But let me just superimpose what you precisely just said on what I'd call connected learning.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, I mean, but the purpose of peer-based culture is how do you actually get these kids to think it's cool?
Yeah.
Okay? That was how we used Lady Gaga, by the way. I mean, it's nothing to do with crowdsourcing.
Yeah.
It's how do kids start thinking that being a part of this peer-based culture, that we're actually discovering things, is actually cool.
Okay.
If you go into Baltimore, if you go into the west side of Oakland or the south side of Chicago, you really have to think about completely redefining what's cool. So I just think that, you know, if you want to talk about a power tool, it's how to get A, the interest, as you saw, and B, the coolness factor, how those things work together with the academics, and how three of those things provide a virtuous circle. Is the kind of the underlying intuition here.
We use the IDEO video of the shopping cart to get the coolness factor in.
Yep.
So as I think about this, and I think about it in the specific context of mobile devices and wireless broadband, it isn't enough just to say we can take a device around that links to some kind of infrastructure and it makes the world a place you can learn.
Right.
The world itself needs to be designed and shaped in ways by people and by the infrastructure that make it an interesting and powerful place to learn culturally, intellectually, and emotionally. And the image that comes to mind, I mean, we don't really have anything like that now. There isn't something like that now. But an image that comes to my mind is the Montessori classroom. Because the genius of Montessori was that there is a big infrastructure in Montessori classrooms. It's not a digital infrastructure. It's an analog, artifact-based infrastructure.
And social.
Yeah.
And social. And social. It's a culture. Right. And the culture and the artifacts are designed to take simple activities out of everyday life that children experience and create them in a way that they're both intriguing and they're deep for learning.
Yeah.
So the blocks are set up so that they're not just blocks, but they're blocks in particular ratios and proportions. And there's units that you do when you're 5 and that you do again when you're 7 and you do again when you're 9, and they're at different, deeper levels. And the pouring the water and the doing things with the sand. And we need to now, with mobile devices, look not just at the classroom and early childhood, but at the world and ask, What kind of infrastructure do we build that lets the world, in the hands of skilled people, become inviting, become a place for learning, become powerful, become coherent? It's a huge challenge. And yet, I think the potential of mobile is that we can tackle that challenge. So, closing thoughts. We've got about 5 minutes, so maybe 2.5 minutes for each of you to give advice as we look forward. What should we be doing to try next with mobile to try to get to cyber learning as we've been discussing it?
Well, I just want to build on what you just said, because I love to start with Montessori and John Dewey at the same time, and then ask, those ideas were fantastic 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. They were way ahead of their time, but there was a fundamental problem. Those ideas did not scale. Okay? The question is, if you capture the deep intuitions of Dewey and Montessori, et cetera, and now superimpose or embed them in the contextual structurings that we can now do with cyber infrastructure, could we actually go back and reinvent and extend the best ideas of Montessorian all the way out, so kids actually think about learning through play, in play, and actually have a sense of being able to constantly tinker with the world when things aren't quite right. Mm-hmm.
And I think the really important thing related to that to think about is that it's not just our kids who we need to be reaching, okay? I mean, our kids are all going to do okay. They have us, okay? We got to reach those kids who are not going to be curious, the ones Lady Gaga is reaching, right?
Yeah, right.
We got to be able to reach those kids who are not going to be naturally curious or don't have the resources to follow up on their curiosity. We got to make sure that we're reaching everybody and helping everybody get curious, helping everybody learn.
Isn't it interesting that maybe through music and art opens up that space quite a bit, while we have been downplaying it all the time?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. Absolutely. I think there are lots of ways to pull people in through what they're interested in to get them interested in all kinds of other things. Yeah, and that's going to be a key.
So I want to thank both JSB and Janet, two very busy people who made the time to come and were willing to get into this sort of open-ended dialogue with us. I'm sorry that we ran out of time for audience questions, but frankly, you were doing so well, and I hope that people will come up afterwards and grab you and have a chance to interact further. But please join me in thanking